see that?
That looks perfect here, yeah.
Fantastic. So as Emma mentioned, what we're going to do is really trying to sum up, 174 pages in a really short 1 hour session. So the outline of the agenda is that we'll do 10 minutes of statistics with a short Q&A afterwards, so that you don't have to remember your questions, 10 minutes of developments with a short Q&A, 5 minutes of research, 10 minutes of case law, and then a Q&A for everything together. So I'm going to kick off with statistics. And really, and I think this goes for all of the things that we're going to present, this is basically a flavor of what's in the report. There's way too much to cover, so I've kind of selected some interesting sections, but I really recommend there's a lot more in there. So if you're interested, go and have a look. So I'm going to start with giving an overview of all migration in Ireland. So this is both immigration and emigration. That's what this graph shows. So you can see the light blue is immigration, and it was about 150,000 in the year. These are not our estimates. These are estimates by the Central Statistics Office. And what you really see in 2023 is, after quite dramatic increases in 2022, a little bit of a plateau. So there's a 5% increase, so still an increase, but very small compared with the 31% the year before. Emigration also increased, so a 9% increase in emigration, which left around a 2% increase in net migration. But again, we're seeing this really strong recovery from the crash, as we have seen since kind of 2012, 2015. And of course, a lot of this is Ukraine. So what we see when we really drill down then into just immigration and we look at where people are coming from, again, this is the Central Statistics Office estimates. We see that largely the flow is the increase is to do with the rest of the world. So that's outside Ireland and the EU, which was 58% of the flow in the year to April 2024. That includes Ukraine. So a lot of this increase is to do with Ukraine, but there's other things happening too, which we'll see as we go through these statistics. One really important thing to note is that 20% of that immigration is returning Irish nationals. Of course, when we think about immigration, we rarely think of return migration as well. And what we also see from this graph is that we're still below the 2007 peak, but there has been kind of a change in where people are coming from. So as you see, before the crash, it was largely kind of EU migration that we were seeing, and that EU migration kind of fell off and hasn't recovered from the crash and the aftermath. So if we have a look then at reasons, and these are a little bit more tricky to get to, but what we do have is residence permits data. So everyone from outside the EU, more or less, needs a residence permit for Ireland. So what this graph shows is the first permits that were issued. So that means, people getting new permits by the reason. So what we see is that in terms of first permits, that's for non-EU people, education really dominates in Ireland, and that's relatively unusual by EU standards. So 45% of first permits issued in 2023 were for education, and as you see, the proportions are relatively similar to previous years. Then we have 27% for employment, 5% for family, and 23% for other. What we can also look at then is all residence permits. So this gives us an idea of everyone who's in the country, so not just those who arrived in 2023, but everyone who's in the country with an active residence permit in 2023. And again, this is just for non-EU people with permits. And one really important caveat of these statistics is that temporary protection, beneficiaries of temporary protection, are not included in these statistics. So this is people from outside the EU, except for beneficiaries of temporary protection. So what we see is that the composition changes slightly when we look at the kind of stock of people who are here. And you see that education is smaller. So education is 21%, employment is 30%, and family is 19%, which implies that people either switch to family permits or that people who come for family reasons stay for longer. And only 3% for international protection, as well as 27% for other. We also see that there was quite a big increase in the all valid permits. That's 24% increase in all valid permits and only a 3% increase in first permits, which is quite an interesting discrepancy. If we drill down then and look at employment permits, we see that we're still seeing really big issuing of employment permits compared with previous years. So if you look kind of 2012 to 2019, the figures now are much, much higher, even though we saw a decrease in 2023. So these decreased by by about 29%, I think, in 2023, but then bounced back in 2024. I added in 2024 data because it was available. And it was really different stories for different sectors, but largely the decrease in employment permits was explained by the information and communication sector around halving, and it's one of the biggest sectors, and also agriculture. The biggest sector for employment permits in 2023 and 2024 is health and social work, which was 32% of permits. Then, of course, international protection gets a lot of attention, and here you can see the application numbers for 2022 and 2023. I didn't add 2024 numbers, but I see they actually just got published. So as we see, it's bigger than previous years. Historically, Ireland had very unusually low international protection applications by Western European standards, and we see that that changed somewhat in 2022 and 2023. And that has increased even more in 2024 with over 18,000. Now, it's important to note that in 2023, the EU also increased by 18%, which was the highest level in the EU since 2015. And in 2023, Ireland actually decreased by 3% compared with the year before. Now, a slightly different story then when we look at the actual the processing system. So we see really big challenges in processing capacity. This shows the number of applications that were pending at the end of the year. And we see that in spite of almost the same or a slight drop in applications in 2023, we're seeing an increasing number of applications pending at the end of the year. So a 47% increase in applications pending. So really big, which means that we're processing fewer than are coming in. So really big challenges there. That is in spite of a really big increase in decisions in the International Protection Office. So the IPO managed to scale up decisions by 90%. And this shows kind of the scale of that increase. It also shows the outcomes of the decision. So it shows a 61% refusal rate. And this might be linked to the change in November 2022, which meant that people from safe countries of origin, so the least likely to get status, were put through accelerated procedures. So a lot of those were getting processed as well. The capacity challenges, I think, are even more stark when you look at the appeals system. So this shows the number of decisions made by the International Protection Appeals Tribunal versus the number of appeals. So we see that there has been some scaling up of decisions. They managed to increase decisions by 22% in 2023, but there were still 359% more appeals pending at the end of 2023 than at the end of 2022. So really big challenges there. If we look at resettlement then, so this is a different form of international protection. It is basically where the government, through the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and the Youth, goes and identifies refugees in collaboration with UNHCR in refugee camps and brings them to Ireland, puts supports in place for them. So it's a slightly more controlled form of international protection migration. And what we see is quite a big drop in resettlement in 2023. So it was 130 people resettled in 2023, a 64% decrease on the year before. And as you can see, kind of 2019 was quite a big year, for resettlement. And the Department of Children kind of cited issues with reception capacity, shortages in housing and reception places, in part due to the increase in international protection and Ukraine, so challenges with accommodation there that affected their ability to resettle. Sticking with the theme of forced migration for the minute, here we have arrivals from Ukraine, and what this really shows is exactly what you'd expect, a really large initial spike in displacements and then kind of a more or less steady. Now, of course, the scale of that spike makes the rest of it seem more steady than I think it often feels when it fluctuates between 500 and 1,000 in a week. But what we see is that for all of 2023, about half the number of PPS numbers were issued to Ukrainians compared with 2022. So a slowing down. And what we really saw was a slowing down from October 2023 onwards as well. If we look then at unaccompanied minors, so particularly vulnerable groups, so this is people under the age of 18 who don't have kind of a legal parent or guardian. And we see that, so TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, is responsible for care of this group. And so we see here the referrals to TUSLA. We've separated out referrals from Ukraine and referrals from other countries, just so that we can try to get comparable data across the years. And we see, relatively big increases compared with previous years, but also then particularly when we include the Ukrainians. So it's really big capacity challenges for TUSLA in trying to scale up quite an intensive support service so quickly. For the first time this year then, and we have to give full credit to Yasmin Dabara for introducing this innovation, we have some integration data in the annual report. So the ESRI produces a much more comprehensive monitoring report on integration, which looks at statistical differences and goes into much more depth in terms of countries of origin and more sophisticated statistical methods. But what we did is that we're just presenting Eurostat data that does have these indicators that we thought was just a really interesting light way of having a look at integration over time. So I'm just presenting a couple of them here. There's more in the report. So this is the third level education levels by country of origin. And what we see is that consistent with what the monitor has found, non-EU migrants have much higher levels of third level education. And you can see that has climbed faster as well over the last 10 years for non-EU than it has for Irish or EU nationals. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we see that in spite of higher levels of education, and we also know that they have higher levels of employment, there are also higher levels of at risk of poverty and social exclusion, which is a measure that is kind of an index of various different indicators of poverty and social exclusion. So we see higher rates for non-EU. Irish and EU are more or less the same, but also that this has been kind of trending downwards since 2015, and I think at a slightly faster rate for non-EU than for others. That was a true whirlwind tour of the statistics. So it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's really in there, but I don't know if we have.
Yeah. We don't have any questions yet, and I would really encourage people to use the Q&A function at the bottom of their screen and ask questions. I'm sure you're absorbing just how much information Ciara has just presented to us. So maybe I'll just kick things off and ask you, Ciara, about kind of one of the key developments in the year, which was this increase in international protection flows. And could you say anything about the drivers behind that, or do we understand what's happened there?
Yeah, so it's subject to a lot of speculation, I think, and one that is relatively hard to understand. We did a report on it back in 2022, looking at the data and literature, trying to explain basically what causes international protection applications to increase. And there was several factors. So some of them are things like global instability. So as I mentioned, the EU is also seeing an increase. So things like the Russian invasion of Ukraine and kind of knock-on effects in different countries, post-COVID-19 impacts in countries as well. But there was also something unusual happening, that Ireland was seeing this different, more of an increase in other EU countries, and there's lots of different stories there. One of them seems to be partial deflection effect from the UK. So for some nationalities that kind of see the UK and Ireland as interchangeable, because the UK policies have become so hostile, there seems to be something of a deflection effect there. But also a lot of this is kind of a long-term social network effect, where Ireland is becoming a country of net immigration, and social networks are a really, really important determinant of where people apply for asylum.
Mm-hmm.
So it was historically unusually low, and we're kind of coming up to what you'd expect.
Great. Okay, thank you, Ciara. So we're starting to get questions to come in now. I'll ask you the first one. I know it's a topic close to your heart. How do we get statistics on emigration?
That is a topic close to my heart. I love to hear it. So I think the question is like how we actually count this. And it, I think the Central Statistics Office kind of do the best that they can, but it is really challenging. So they use different data sources. One of them is they look at the most common, the countries that Irish people tend to emigrate to, and they look at statistics from there. So visa statistics from Australia, from the UK. I think they might look at Canada as well. But then, one of the biggest sources is actually survey data, which of course is not a perfect way of getting immigration data. It's the Labour Force Survey, which is a quarterly household survey. 25,000 households get targeted, and basically they ask, was there anyone living here last year who is no longer here and where have they gone, and etc. etc. Which of course is not perfect if the entire household has migrated or if people don't know who was living there a year before, but it is kind of the best we have. Other countries of course have population registers and things that make it much easier to actually get better data on that. But yeah, that's how we do it.
Thanks, Ciara. There's a question here on residence permit data, and can you say anything about the other category?
Yes, really good question. So we've tried to get an idea of the other category, and I think it's a little bit different for both of them. When you look at what residence permits are actually available, there's a huge number of categories, and we're not fully certain what is counted in which category. So things like, retirees don't easily fit into any of the categories. It could be things, now entrepreneurs might be counted in employment, but they could be counted in other things like that. In the first permits, international protection isn't in there, so probably they're counted in other. And then things like, possibly graduate visas, we're not fully sure. I think we'd like to get more clarity on that in the future.
And I'll just ask you one final question because I know we need to move on to the next section. But do we know anything about large drops in ICT and agriculture employment permits? Do you have any background to what might have happened there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, ICT permits dropped by half in 2023. So they were about 10,000, and I think they were 5,000 something in 2023. That was the year I think that there was a lot of tech companies doing layoffs, is my memory of it. I haven't really looked into the reasons behind it, but just that was kind of what triggered for me. The agriculture one is a really good question, and that actually hasn't recovered in 2024. So we see kind of this sectoral shift in employment permits as well. And one thing that's important to note about employment permits is that it's not just a function of the demand for labor, it's also a function of the ability to actually recruit that labor. So part of it could be challenges in actually finding people to fill the shortages as well.
Great, thanks, Ciara. And if we can get back to any of the other questions, we'll do our best.